Good evening, everybody. My name is Steven, and I'm a student in the Political Science 310 class at Iowa State. And today I'll be talking about the California Assembly Bill by 40. So just a little bit about AB 540. It's commonly known as the California Non-Resident Tuition Exemption. Uh, it's also known as the California Education Code 68130.5, as this bill involves education, so that's why it's in the California Education Code. It was introduced by California Assembly members Fireball and Maldonado. I'm sorry if I butcher those names. And it was signed into law on October 12th, 2001 by California Governor Gray Davis. And its current status is that it is current legislation. So what is AB 540? AB 540 states that certain students, and I quote, shall be exempted from paying non-resident tuition at all public colleges and universities in California if they meet the following requirements. Attended a California high school for 3 or more years, graduated from a California high school with a high school diploma or obtained the equivalent, so a GED, be registered or currently enrolled in one of the 3 state institutions of higher education in California, and essentially they filed the paperwork once their immigration status changes. So I mentioned certain students, right? So who are these certain students? These are students who are non-residents of California because they are not documented, non-documented immigrants, meaning, and some people would say they would be illegal immigrants. It would just be undocumented, and these are also students with non-immigrant status. So just as an example, my dad, he is originally from Taiwan. He was born there, and he came to the United States under a student visa to do his PhD. And that visa that he had as a student, as an international student, is not considered in permanent immigration visa, if you will. And there are many different visas. And another question you might have is, so what are the 3 state institutions of higher education in California? And those 3 would be the California Community College, the California State University, and University of California. And these are all pretty big higher education systems. The University of California has 10 campuses, and these include like UC Berkeley, UCLA. Those are the more famous ones, I guess. The California State University has 23 campuses. Those would be like Cal State Long Beach, and also Cal Poly, if you're familiar. And the Community College of California has 116 campuses, so they are pretty big in terms of size. And so what is the goal of AB 540? So the goal of AB 540 is to make higher education affordable and accessible to worthy students so that they can acquire college education. The background of this is that undocumented immigrant students and their families, right? So they might not have a big presence in a state like Iowa, but in California, they do have a sizable presence. And because of their status as undocumented Under the old law, they would be considered non-residents and therefore would have to pay non-resident tuition, where them and their families have already contributed to the state of California through their taxes. So the thought behind it was, why are they not able to enjoy the educational benefits as California taxpayers just because of their undocumented immigration status? The why continued. This So AB 540 aims to establish a more fair process in the realm of public California higher education. Um, they've earned their way to access this higher education through being admitted as a student, um, and and California, especially for the UCs, their acceptance rates are quite low. So, the standard is pretty high. So they've already met that standard, and therefore, their immigration status shouldn't be a barrier uh, to obtain that education, because, you know, in-state tuition is much cheaper than out-of-state tuition, right? And especially if their families have already paid in California's taxes, they've kind of earned. It's kind of their right to have that in-state tuition. Uh, and other reasons why is that um, they're likely to remain in state in California, and when they remain in state, they invest in California's economy. So, you have these highly educated people that will contribute to California's productivity and economy, right? And you don't want to suffer a brain drain or deny those opportunities to people who are obviously qualified, academically to do bigger and better things. Um, the how. So the background here was that, um, as I said before, this bill was passed in 2001. At the time, another U.S. state, Texas, was also considering a similar bill, and Texas was actually the number one state, and obviously the bill in Texas, similar to California's AB 540, did pass. So Texas was number one, and California was number two. And you can see here on this chart that other states have also joined in on bills similar to AB 540, allowing non-documented immigrant students to pay in-state tuition. Granted that they've been in that state's high school for X amount of years. Usually it's 3. And just more of the background is that so it was introduced to the California legislature by Assemblymember Marco A. Farball, and he's a Democrat from Southgate, and also Assemblymember Abel O. Maldonado Jr. Again, I'm sorry if I butchered your name. He's a Republican from Santa Maria. And it was signed by Governor Gray Davis. He was a Democrat, governor of California from 1999 to 2003. And what I'm trying to show here is that this seems to be bipartisan, right? So you got both Democrats and Republicans both agreeing on this bill, to pass this bill. And if you look at those states, you'll generally see, so I've counted Each state pretty much leans either Democrat or leans Republican. Um, for example, California leans Democrat and Texas leans Republican, right? So if you look at these states on that chart, you get 5 Democrat states and 5 Republican states. So I think it's a bipartisan effort. That politics really didn't play too much. The two parties didn't really play too much of a role in making this decision and making the AB 540 pass. How continued. So this bill, AB 540, enjoyed a lot more support than opposition. As I said before, it seemed to be a enjoyed bipartisan support, meaning it's not a tight 50-50. You know what I mean? And the California legislature website actually does have an official registered list of both supporters and opposition, right? And under support, they have 24 organizations and, quote, several individual letters, end quote, right? And the opposition only had one organization and individual letters. And I'll show that list in one of the later slides here. So the opposition, their main focus was that AB 540 violates federal law because it would enable all non-residents of California to qualify for resident tuition, right? And meanwhile, they're continuing to charge regular, if you will, non-residents with the non-resident tuition. They have a specific issue with Section 505, and I have it down here on the PowerPoint slide, and it basically says that it basically considers that, hey, if you consider these undocumented immigrant students as non-residents, right? So if they are non-residents and you are offering them eligibility to pay resident tuition, then therefore you should offer all non-residents the eligibility to pay resident tuition, right? Because how would you say to one group of non-residents, like, hey, you are eligible to pay resident tuition, and to the other group of non-residents that, hey, you have to pay non-resident tuition. If you look at it that way, it doesn't seem fair. So that's the issue that the opposition had. And as you know, there's a big financial difference between in-state and out-of-state. Especially in California. California is already an expensive place to live, and that carries over to in-state and out-of-state tuition. So the who, right? I mentioned before about the list of supporters and opposition. So you can see that list of supporters. So you generally have diversity groups, the civil rights groups, educator groups, and universities. So you like the I believe it's called the American Civil Liberties Union, and also, the California Teachers Group, or something similar to that, uh, and the uh, Mexican American um, groups, the Asian American groups. So I think you get the idea. And the opposition were mainly anti-immigration groups or groups that are not happy with the current immigration status, so they want to reform immigration, um, and they were kind of they are against bills like AB 540. Um, so before I move to this slide, and I do apologize because this is my first time using record on PowerPoint, and I realized, you can't go back to a slide. At least I don't know how, so I do apologize. But I do want to talk about David uh, David Easton's inputs and outputs, right? So I kind of talked about it already. I just didn't put the inputs and outputs um, to actual terms to apply to this case, right? And the inputs are who pushed for and against the policy. So who pushed for it would be, as I said, it was a bipartisan effort, so really almost everybody. And well, especially those diversity groups, civil rights groups. Um, in my opinion, generally people who lean to the left a little bit, right? And uh, also, also that being fair to taxpayers, those undocumented taxpayers who have already paid into the system, and therefore they should get a benefit out of it, right? So making that process more fair, and and of course, who were against it were, as I talked before, the anti-immigration or immigration reform folks, and I think those people lean to the right a little bit more. And um, the output is, the passage of AB 540 that obviously passed, and um, its consequences, if you will. So, well, consequences sounds negative, but I guess the fruits of 540 of AB 540. Um, so you get highly educated people, even if they were undocumented immigrants, that they contribute to, they get a great education, and they give back to the system by continuing to stay in California and help the economy um, by using the skills that they learned in college, and helping the California economy that way, right, through their jobs. Uh, so now moving on to and on the previous slide where I showed the supporters and the opposition, those could be considered black box institutions as well. All right, now moving on to consequences. So in 2010, there was a case, Martinez versus the University of California, right? So Martinez, so the University of California was in support of continuing AB 540, and Martinez argued against it. Kind of the opposition that I talked about earlier, that hey, if this group of non-residents can pay resident tuition, then therefore all of the non-residents. So for example, if like somebody who's a resident of Iowa, that they would be eligible to pay resident tuition for a university in California, or a public university in California, that kind of thing, right? Um, at the end of the day, the California Supreme Court ruled in favor of the defendant, which was the University of California, and that upheld AB 540. But through this, they found that there was a study in that 70% of AB 540 students in the University of California system were either US citizens or documented immigrants. And remember, the goal, the key audience, if you will, it was of AB 540, it was directed towards non-documented immigrants. So, you know, if 70% are not in this undocumented group, it's like, are they really, is AB 540 really hitting the goals that it originally had? And as I talked about, there's a big difference between resident and non-resident tuition. So if you think of the non-documented immigrant students as non-residents, then in that mindset, you'll have the reduction of revenue for California public universities. Obviously, $14,000 is a lot less than $48,000. So, you know, there's a reduction of revenue for California public universities there. So, questions, right? And I want to say, you know, California is my home state. I was born and raised in California. You know, I've graduated from California high school. I went to California high school for all 4 years of high school. So I would qualify for AB 540. Now, I went to Iowa State, and I paid non-resident tuition to Iowa State, but things happened, and eventually I gained Iowa State. I gained how do I put this? I became an Iowa resident, even for tuition purposes, right? So there are some certain steps to do that, and I did that, and now I'm an Iowa resident, and I'm no longer a California resident. But under AB 540, if I go to, if I want to take a class at a public California university, under AB 540, I am allowed to not pay the non-resident tuition. So my first question is, should I be allowed to do that? Right? I don't pay taxes to California anymore. So, you know, so should any non-resident students who qualify for paying let me start over here. Should any non-resident students who qualify for paying resident tuition under AB 540 continue their eligibility even if they have claimed residency for tuition purposes in another state? So kind of the situation I described that I was in. And also number two, since immigration to the United States, both documented and undocumented, is at the federal level and not at the state level, should there be some kind of national standard that the issue of undocumented immigrant students' eligibility to pay resident tuition? So should the federal government set a precedence of, hey, you know, either these undocumented immigrant students are either eligible to pay resident tuition in their states or not? So those are two of my questions, and I look forward to hearing from you tonight. Thanks.